Woof. Well, I'm super honored to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm one voice in a long lineage of mycologists and experts that extends literally back thousands of years. So it is my moment on stage today, but many other great scientists and mycologists and shamans have preceded me. And so what I'm going to show you is a continuation of knowledge keepers. And now with our technologies and all the interest that is occurring, sweeping the planet, now the field of data is being populated like never before. But it's an affirmation that many indigenous peoples have held true is now confirmed, and even more so being expanded. Shamanistic practices in indigenous cultures are never static. We are all indigenous to this earth. So we are expanding the body intellect of knowledge through all of our experiences and sharing information. And this is the message of psilocybin. Psilocybin teaches you that we are all one. We are all one people. And we need to share this information together in order to protect this precious planet. So I'm going to take you on a rocket ship, magical mushroom mystery tour. Open your receptors, hold on to your hats, put on your seatbelts. So here we go. So my talk is how psilocybin mushrooms can save the world. That's not metaphoric. I'm actually increasingly convinced it's a narrative that is populated with very important facts. We are at a time critical in the evolution of our species. Our planet is in crisis. Unless we have a paradigm shift in consciousness, we will not be able to put into practice the applications and strategies to build a common community of interest. And I think many of the problems that we face today throughout the world is because people are destabilized because of fear. Because when they're afraid, they strike out. So one of the great lessons of psilocybin is to remove that instability and realize that you have friends all around you all the time. They may speak different languages, they may be of a different nationality, they may be a different racial history, but indeed, I believe in the goodness of people. We are all one people. Fundamentally, I think, is the power of goodness that pervades the universe. It's just a matter of us to be able to tap into it. So I do have some disclosures, because I want you to show my prejudices, but I don't know the difference between my avocation and my vocation. Right? All of you, you pursue your interest. If you pursue your interest, you have a bias, right? Otherwise, you would not be pursuing your interest. So it's kind of a circular reasoning. But nevertheless, for the sake of transparency, I founded a company. I'm the sole owner. I have 145 wonderful employees who are part of this narrative. We have co-founded a new company in the psychedelic space, Mycomedica Life Sciences. And one of my co-founders is here, Dr. Pamela Crisco, who's part of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, leading clinical trials up there. And we have created a new nonprofit called the Center for Ecological Consciousness, which is a play on the ecology of consciousness and the consciousness of ecology. You can work with that. I don't have to interpret it. I have multiple books and a new book that I'm currently writing as well. So that being said, let's look at how many psilocybin mushroom species there are. More than 140 species circumnavigate. Over 5,600 collections have been made since the 1800s. These psilocybin species are resident across every continent except for Antarctica so far. So whether you're Irish, whether you're from North Africa, whether you're Mesoamerican, whether you are in the Northwest Canada, all these regions of the world, indigenous peoples would discover magic mushrooms. But mushrooms are different. We know what mushrooms are edible and poisonous from the experiences of people who've eaten them before us, right? It helps you select down the gene pool for the people who make mistakes. But we know similarly which ones are magical. But what's different about mushrooms is their ephemerality. They're so ephemeral. And so plants and animals are in your viewscape, your event horizon, constantly, for weeks, months, years. But mushrooms, which are so powerful, that come up and sprout and then disappear in 5 days, Some can feed you, some can kill you, some are medicinal that can heal you, and some can send you on a powerful journey. Subsequent to that powerful journey, as your memory recedes and the mushrooms disappear, you go months, years into the future, you have that, what it was that? Because our familiarity of contact gives us confidence. So the cognoscenti in indigenous cultures held this sacred knowledge. It was very precious and ephemeral because of it being so tenuous. When there was invasions, when religious persecution, domination from invading armies, those tenuous threads of knowledge oftentimes were severed. Now we're at a space with our technology, because of the internet and all of us being here, that we can share this information. So hopefully it'll be forever preserved. We are very, very fortunate that there are some threads going back in history. These echoes in the archaeological record are also from various regions of the world. The Mesoamerican mushroom stones from 2500 BC to 1500 AD. Interestingly, in about the same period of time in Greece, Demeter here is featured giving Persephone a mushroom before she goes into the underworld. And then this speaks to the Eleusinian mysteries. Many of you know this. Socrates, Plato, many other Greek philosophers all partook of the Eleusinian mysteries once in a lifetime. Thousands of people in a great telestron would imbibe this mushroom concoction, it is believed. Albert Hofmann was one of the co-authors of a book called The Road to Eleusis and presented this concept. And then we had this amazing cave art from northern Algeria, 7,000 years ago. Now, obviously, the artist was very excited about mushrooms. And mushrooms, because they rot so quickly, it was well discovered throughout the world that if you put them in honey, it would help preserve them. Well, this may actually have led to psychoactive meads. And the Bavarian Beer Act of 1560 in Europe specifically banned mushrooms from beer. And there's a very big influence of Catholicism. And so some of us speculate that maybe that was one way that the Catholic Church was trying to suppress the indigenous use of magic mushrooms by Germanic peoples who would go into the forest and have these ceremonies celebrating nature. An extraordinary record is kept with preserved by one of the Catholic priests, Sehogun, who also around the same time as the Bavarian Beer Act, a very interesting coincidence, recorded the use of magic mushrooms. Extraordinary. They ate them before dawn with honey. They also drank basically chocolate before dawn. The mushrooms they ate with honey, when they began to get heated from them, they began to dance, and some sang and some wept. Some cared not to sing, but would sit down in their rooms and stayed pensive-like. Then there was the drunkenness of the mushrooms that passed. They spoke with the visions that they had seen. This could have been written today, right? This is a contemporaneously accurate description of what these, ancestors were experiencing. And no doubt this extended way before the Spaniards came to the New World. But we know about this primarily now today because of two extraordinary women. Maria Sabina was a Mazatec shaman in Oaxaca, and Maria Sabina had many disciples. And Maria Sabina used a mushroom called Psilocybe zapaticorum, a wild mushroom. She did not use Psilocybe cubensis. This is important for you to know. This is a wild mushroom that she would go into the forest to find. Knowing the differences between the psilocybin mushrooms and non-psilocybin mushrooms, I propose to you she was not only a shaman, she was a mycologist. This is important. Now, R. Gordon Wasson gets a lot of attention, and it's important that he does get credit. But it was Valentina Wasson who was the true mycologist in their relationship. She knew Latin binomials. She first introduced R. Gordon Wasson, her husband, on a honeymoon in upstate New York in the Adirondacks when they found some mushrooms, and he was horrified and she was excited. That was the dawn of the terms they coined, mycophilia and mycophobia, the love of mushrooms and the fear of mushrooms. When millions of copies of Life magazine appeared during the Cold War on the steppes of Americans, there was an accurate description of how to identify these mushrooms and a great stories of R. Gordon Wasson's experience. Unfortunately, Valentina died and also around 1958. So, but these two women mycologists I present to you, they were tipping points that really accelerated and preserved in this knowledge. With all of its problems that many of us know, but nevertheless, as we move forward, we have to give credit to these fantastic ethnomycologists, Maria Sabina and Valentina Wasson. So I got first introduced to magic mushrooms through my older brother, John. He went to Yale, he went down to Mexico and Colombia, came back with these amazing trips, literally, trip reports, We didn't call them trip reports, we should have. I was 14 years of age. He brought me this book, and I just read this book. It was amazing, it was incredible, I loved it. And my best friend, Ryan, wanted to borrow the book. And so he borrowed the book, and I said, Ryan, you've got to give the book back to me. My brother John's going back to Yale. He was on break, and he lent me his textbook. Well, Ryan kept on avoiding the subject when I asked for the book back. And so after repeated requests, and finally I cornered Ryan, and it was at the very last few days, my brother was returning. He was pressuring me to get his textbook back. I said, Ryan, I need the textbook back now. Let's get it now. And he says, I can't get it, Paul. And I said, why? And he says, my father found it and burned it. I said, your father burned my brother's book? I had the oh shit moment, what am I going to tell my older brother, which he was not happy at all. I was greatly ashamed and very, very upset. But I thought, if that book inspired Ryan's conservative father, so scared of altered states of consciousness, to have that book be burned, then I think I found the path that I want to pursue. So I went forward. I immersed myself at the age of 17 in studying magic mushrooms, going to libraries at the University of Washington in Seattle, in the basement. Most of my generation, you hunted for information. The pages of the books were all razored out. And so I was self-taught. I did deep immersion. And 45 years ago, I published my first book on psilocybin mushrooms when I was 24 years of age. Writing it really when I was on 19. So I do have a long history with psilocybin. And from that long history and perspective, I feel a very strong duty and obligation that we keep this movement alive with respect, with the proper guardrails, that we reach across the aisle to those who may be going off the rails, to bring them back into the path that will be most sustainable and respectful to these ancient medicines and their indigenous uses. I want to give tribute to my father, who's a scientist, my mother, who's a charismatic Christian, a wonderful woman, and then my brother John. My other mentors are Dr. Daniel Stuntz, Catherine Skates, Michael Bugh, and Dr. Alexander Smith. So I went on, I've published 4 new species of psilocybin mushrooms and named them. Psilocybe azurescens, Psilocybe wiley, which I named after Dr. Andrew Weil, my dear friend, Psilocybe cynofibulosa, and Psilocybe liniformis variety americana. And then last week, out of the blue, quote unquote, no idea this was coming, I have a new species of psilocybin mushroom named after me, Psilocybe Stametsi. And for us, the pronounced Latin binomials, Stametsi has a nice rhythm to it, So Psilocybe Stametsi, it has the cutest little nipple on top too, It's such a cute mushroom, I love it. So it's in Ecuador. It's probably the best documented psilocybin mushroom ever discovered. Giuliana Furshi of the Fungi Foundation was on the path, literally, in the Ecuadorian cloud forest with 2 government officials from the government judiciary of Ecuador. They all had their cell phones. And so they found it and they recorded everything. So it's amazing. There's only 2 specimens in existence. And I've been invited, with Ecuadorian government approval to go to this nature preserve. Some people ask, are you going to eat it? No way, there's only 2 specimens in the world that's ever been found. I'll try cubensis, I'm not going to eat Stametsi, But this is a huge, huge honor, and I feel even more strengthened in my resolve to carry this knowledge with responsibility. So psilocybes, you have purple-brown spore prints, generally speaking. The spores germinate, and you can make a spore print. Here in the taxonomy of psilocybin mushrooms, spore color is extremely important dark purple-brown spores to black spores are what these mushrooms form. We can generate cultures from tissue, from spores, and then in response to 4 environmental stimuli, typically introduction of water, rain, flooding, coincident with a drop in temperature, the mycelium comes to the surface, exhales carbon dioxide, inhales oxygen, exposed to light. Those 4 primary environmental triggers stimulate the mycelium to produce the mushroom fruit bodies, which then, of course, produce the spores. So the mycelium grows out in like an internet-like design, which I'm fascinated by. And my friend Patrick Hickey took these micrographs of nuclei streaming through the mycelial networks. Because the mycelial networks, there can be literally trillions of endpoints, the breadth of my arms, of the mycelium in the ground. Through epigenesis, like little scientists at every little tip, and they're doing experiments. They encounter a new toxin, a new food source. They can then code for enzymes that can break down that new encounter, potentially the food source. And if they're successful, what happens? The mycelium streams, it's being fed. And that information is back-channeled back into the mother mycelium. So these are learning membranes. So I believe matter begets life, life becomes single cells become strings, strings fork, strings interlace, mosaics form, and inevitably, mycelial-like networks will form throughout the universe. It is no coincidence that we've invented the internet, which is a repetition in my mind of a previously proven ecologically successful design, that of mycelium, that of our nerves in our brain. And waxing poetic, when you look at the expanse of the universe and looking at dark matter, it also forms this internet mycelial-like structure. This is the way. This is the way of matter. This is the way of life. We're all embedded into this microverse of interconnectivity. The primordia are forming. Psilocybe cubensis is the easiest one to grow. But because I have an hour, and I just came from a talk, I only had 20 minutes, I felt the audience was robbed of the experience that I want to share with you. Many of you have not collected psilocybin mushrooms. Before I go there, let me ask this. How many people in this room have not taken psilocybin mushrooms, have not eaten them? So about a third of you. And I would imagine a lot more of you have not collected psilocybin mushrooms. So I'm going to show you 3 short little videos of my hunting and discovering psilocybin mushrooms. So here's the first one. Hopefully the audio will work. So tech department, here we go. Greetings, and meet Psilocybe azurescens. Psilocybe azurescens is probably one of the most potent mushrooms in the world. It contains psilocybin and psilocin up to 2% of its dried mass. Now think of that. 2% of the dried mass of this mushroom are psychoactive crystals. Why would a mushroom produce so much? We don't know, but it certainly has attracted the interest of humans. The bluing that you see here is a bruising reaction. It's indicative of psilocin as it degrades. And the more bluing you see, the more psilocin there once was. Now psilocybin dephosphorylates into psilocin, and when you ingest these mushrooms, psilocin becomes a serotonin agonist. It means that the psilocybin or the psilocin becomes a temporary neurotransmitter, opening up the floodgates of the senses. Now this mushroom is sinuous. It's got a sinuous stem, which means it bends back and forth. It is bluing very, very strongly, and it has these very indicative spore color here on the annular zone. And the spore color is purple-brown, and the mushrooms are bluish. Those 2 features in combination pretty much de facto determines its psilocybin. Now look how bodacious the rhizomorphs are at the base of the stem. This is a large psilocybe, by far the largest one that I know, that grows on wood chips in the Pacific Northwest. It is now a popular one to have in your backyard. It's just fun, it's just naturalized in the woods here. And this is a beautiful fruiting of them. And the psilocybes, many of the woodland psilocybes have this chestnut brown caramel color. This one is unique in that it's got these umbos, and there is a broad umbo, and the cap is very circular. The bruising reactions just from impact of rain, perhaps. This mushroom is one of the most fascinating and interesting ones to grow. Those who choose to partake of this mushroom should be warned. These are exceptionally potent, and oftentimes they can cause temporary paralysis, loss of muscle control,
So that is not a good thing. It seems that most people who boil this mushroom in hot water, those symptoms seem to be alleviated. But this is clearly a sacred species, and I love just personally touching it. This is not a mushroom that I enjoy eating. It's almost too potent for me. And but it is a species that I greatly admire. I love touching it. I love handling it. I love seeing it. And it's a great indicator of the habitat in my magical mushroom forest that is very conducive to spiritual experiences.
Now you compare psilocybe azurescens to psilocybe cyanescens, and it's known as the wavy cap. You can see the azurescens has the even cap edge, and cyanescens is like this sine wave. So here is a wild psilocybe cyanescens patch. And they grow in the wood chips. Now, if you notice, it's just not wood chips. There's lichens, there's moss, there's a complex microbiome. These are primary saprophytes, which means they break down alder and oak and other types of wood chips as soon as they're rendered available. About a year later, then they'll start sprouting the mushrooms. But you can see how blue the stems are. Another species is Psilocybe stuntzii, named after Daniel Stuntz, one of my teachers. It's got a little ring, and the ring typically turns bluish. It's really interesting. But unfortunately, there are some deadly poisonous species that grow right side by side with the magic mushrooms. This is Galerana marginata. And the Galerana marginata is deadly poisonous, containing the amanita alpha toxins, the cyclopeptides that can kill you. And I found that collection, and when I found it, I was startled because I thought most people collecting Psilocybe stuntzii, if they saw this collection, they'd grab both. Galeranas have rusty brown spores, psilocybin or psilocybe mushrooms have purple brown spores. Well, then there's Psilocybe pelliculosa. Well, it also grows in wood chips, and also Galerana marginata grows there as well. So Psilocybe pelliculosa is the only species I've found truly in the old growth forest. All the other species are associated with human activity. Very interesting. And their Psilocybe pelliculosa is known as a trail follower in the old growth forest, so they're very common on trails, very uncommon deep in the forest. So they're also in a sense associated with human activity. But so many of these psilocybin mushrooms are associated with either cutting of wood, chipping, etc. So where is the native origins of these psilocybin mushrooms that grow on wood chips? Well, I suggest to you, beavers, woodpeckers, squirrels, voles. Psilocybe azurescens, we found a vole tunnel that was honeycombed with white azurescens mycelium. I thought, wow, if I could be that vole, running through iridescent blue mycelial corridors, right? So we think that these chipping behavior, and whether these psilocybin mushrooms might actually be called with endophytes, living inside of the trees. And only when the trees are chipped, then suddenly they're stimulated into formation. So Psilocybe semilanceata, the liberty cap, it also grows in many places of the world, southern Chile, it grows in Ireland, and of course throughout northern Europe and the Pacific Northwest. It loves to be associated with ponds. It does not bruise bluish, but it has a little nipple. So let's go on a little mushroom hunt for liberty caps.
Regions of Europe and the Pacific Northwest, one of the most interesting psilocybes to collect is one that grows near ponds in the grass. And this field has not had cows on it for more than 10 years. So cows and sheep can help, but they're not necessary. And this is Psilocybe semilanceata, the famed liberty cap. It's exquisite little fruiting here. It's got a translucent striate margin. You can see the striations, they're actually the gills showing through the cap. And the cap also has a separable gelatinous pellicle. So here is one over here we can look at. And as you tear the cap, there is a film that's clearly visible. And you can say, whoa, that's a really big one. And that film stretches and then breaks. So these mushrooms have purple-brown spores, a separable gelatinous pellicle, and they typically have a sharp umbo or a nipple at the very, very top of the cap. And this papilla or nipple is not always in every specimen, but it's quite characteristic of the species in general. So Psilocybe semilanceata. Many people, when they pick semilanceata, they don't realize that the stem is so long. I think it's a mutualistic species with the rhizomes of grass, almost like a pseudo-mycorrhizal relationship, which means it's not obligatory, but it benefits from it. And the stems often are picked because people don't realize that the stem length is way, way down. So be careful. Always try to get the base of the stem if you can.
Now, I am going to boast a little bit. That was me filming that whole thing with my camera going like this. I realized, oh my gosh, that was actually pretty good for a one-handed shot. All of us know what that means, right? So Psilocybe cubensis is by far the easiest to grow. It grows in the subtropics on dung, and here on elephant dung, hippopotamus dung, zebra dung, really prefers cows. But because this mushroom is so easy to grow, this is the primary species currently used throughout the world. Now we have to give credit to many people, but Dr. Andrew Weil was hugely influential in my life. And he actually wrote a foreword to my book before I even met him, Psilocybe Mushrooms and Their Allies, in 1978. But in 1977, he published in the Harvard Botanical Leaflets sort of like a story report of the psilocybin mushroom movement surging in Oregon and elsewhere, but primarily Oregon. And he saw this as a cultural phenomenon, and because he was a Harvard physician, he foretold that psilocybin mushrooms would have medicinal properties, not only from his own use, but he was very good at intuiting that psilocybin had a fantastic future for mental health. Also, we want to give credit to Terence McKenna, who is a dear and good friend. And these are my books, and two of Terence's books, but it's that Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. That is the spark that just spread information like crazy. And I call it the Psilocybe cubensis Scholarship Fund. Many of us of my age know this well, maybe even currently. People will grow psilocybes in their closets at college, et cetera, and they'd use this to pay their tuition, pay groceries, very small scale cultivation. But from Andy's work and that of others, then we started a series of mushroom conferences. And this event today is the continuity, the lineage of us sharing knowledge on psilocybin mushrooms. So you're all part of this vein of knowledge. So we started these actually in 1977, and this is one I think is from 1979. These persisted. We also, conferences were done in Europe, and at the psychoactivity conference in the center, you'll see Albert Hofmann, Sasha and Ann Shulgin, myself, and many other experts in psychoactive plants. And so this is a community. It's just not just people who are psychonauts focused on psilocybin. There's a lot of sort of, crosstalk, between the different experts sharing their knowledge of neuroreceptors and uses and practices and safety and tragedies and mistakes. So we all collectively are honing our skills therapeutically to be able to maximize benefit, maximize safety, minimize harm. I am a merry prankster, and I realized that I knew Ken Kesey and the merry pranksters, but I also knew the psychedelic scientists. So at the Millennium Mushroom Conference that I put on with a friend in 1999, we brought the merry pranksters. And those of you who don't know about the merry pranksters, it's the electric acid Kool-Aid tests. If you go back, it's the Beat generation evolving into the revolution, of the 1960s. And so Ken Kesey, Ken Babbs, George Walker, Mountain Girl, who married Jerry Garcia, and then Sunshine is the daughter of Ken Kesey and Mountain Girl. You can figure that one out. But it was a wonderful, amazing conference that we brought these people together, and it was as synaptic junctions were forming and synaptogenesis of these great minds. So where we are today, now this is spread. And the United States and Canada are largely leading the way, and there are some pockets in England and the Netherlands and in Germany, but pretty much that's the vanguard of the research. But in the United States, there is over 22 states. I think there's 2 more states in the past 2 weeks that have bills or ballots that are at various stages of advancing. In Colorado, of course, in Oregon, the bills have passed, they've become law. Now, politicians are somewhat hesitant to stick their necks out to advocate for psychedelic science, but this is a people's revolution. Washington State's bill has now been largely killed because of concerns, some of which are valid, some of which are, I think, clearly political. But when the people speak through a ballot, the politicians get a pass. The law enforcement gets a pass. When the people speak and make it a law, they're employees of the people. They must enact and protect the law that has been passed. So I encourage all of you to be involved in state ballot initiatives. This is clearly the way that we're going to be able to spread this medicine far and wide. And in Canada has really led the charge, especially with the leadership of Dr. Pam Crisco, who's here in the audience, and many other of her colleagues. They're doing group psychedelic therapy with psilocybin with end-of-life patients. With Canadian government approval, more than 40 patients facing existential fear of death are going in group therapy, 8 patients approximately at a time, 8 therapists with high doses of psilocybin coming out the other end with extraordinary healing. So you'll be hearing more about that. So let's look at 4 meta-studies. Now these meta-studies are important to designing clinical studies. So clinicians want to see, are there reports, are there case reports? So during these meta-surveys, this is with prisoners, 485,000 prisoners, significant reduction in several aspects of crime, larceny, theft, burglary, violent crime. Psilocybin was the only psychedelic that was associated with this metric. Then we look at intimate partner-to-partner violence. In this study, 1,266 community members. And psilocybin, again, was the only psychedelic associated with a reduction of partner-to-partner violence. I always thought if you have a dating app, have you tripped on psilocybin? Okay, I think that's a better candidate than a person who hasn't, right? Left, right. So then another interesting study, the associated psychedelics with opioid use disorder. Again, psilocybin is the only one that's associated with a reduction of opioid use disorder. And so another study came out on nature relatedness. Here again, psilocybin was the only psychedelic that was associated with a statistically significant increase in nature relatedness. I have a little bit of problem with the study because I've done high doses of LSD and I felt nature relatedness as well. But I haven't felt that with MDMA. So I think psilocybin and LSD enhances your sensitivity to the health of the ecosystem. Okay, so these are meta-studies, and this is important because what's happening out there? Can you see a trend? Are there associations? Are the associations random? Are they significant? Our associations aren't necessarily causation, but they can be. And so they kind of befuddle. How do you see, a true signal? Well, those signals now are being presented in clinical studies. There's more than 120 clinical studies registered at clinicaltrials.gov. Think of that, 120, and more being populated every month. So with those of you who are physicians or researchers know this well. You have to go in front of the IRB boards, institutional review boards. And there's groups of physicians and scientists who look at, is the clinical study justified? Is it targeting a disease or a mental health condition that is currently not adequately being addressed, like treatment-resistant depression? Is it scalable? Is it affordable? Is it likely not to cause harm? And there's an FDA statement, or an FDA official came out, and after his analysis, this FDA official said, of all the drugs that he has ever studied, psilocybin is the most potent, least toxic substance they've ever seen. So now there's a problem with these clinical studies, and most of them are high doses of psilocybin, is how do you design a placebo double-blind control? And the idea is you want to give 2 great patient populations, one with a medicine, one without. So you can do a placebo. Well, I couldn't have said it better than this cartoon. Which means every clinical study using a high dose of psilocybin and a placebo is inherently flawed. I mean, this is shocking to me. Dr. Pam and I saw this instantly. And yet we had all these, it's the hubris of scientists. Well, we can design a clinical study with a placebo, but they've never done psilocybin. No shit, Sherlock. So, but, macrodosing and microdosing are fundamentally different. And I'll be talking about microdosing in just a minute. So now, there are several clinical studies, placebo double-blind control, that do show very interesting results. despite the problem with the placebo. One is with treatment-resistant depression here, or major depression disorder. These are clinical trials published in New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. And so, yes, there seems to be really powerful medicines for breaking addiction. And another one with alcohol, one of the most abused and addictive substances that we know of. Reducing binge drinking from 2 sessions of psilocybin at high doses. Well, this is extraordinary because you have this 2 different groups of people with mental health challenges, disorders that are being treated, with a new medicine with really good results. Well, Dr. Roland Griffiths and a number of his colleagues proposed, because Schedule I substances mean that there is no medical use, high potential for abuse and addiction. Well, Schedule I psilocybin doesn't fit Schedule I. It should not be there. Because it's in Schedule I, it has inhibited the ability of researchers to move forward. So this is why we need to reschedule psilocybin. We need to reschedule most of the psychedelics. They should not be in Schedule I. These are non-addictive substances. They do not have a high potential for abuse, and they do have a very important medical potential application. So, anyone here knows President Biden? Please advocate that he reschedules psilocybin and psychedelics, away from Schedule I. We'll see, folks. It's really unfortunate in many ways. I have just received my DEA license for psilocybin. I'm really happy about that. And one of the things, my mantra, many of you know it, I have a mantra, nature provides, I don't. I am not a psychotherapist. I have seen people have bad trips. About 30% of the people in these clinical studies do have bad trips. I'm not skilled. And I feel like you have an incredible responsibility when you give a powerful medicine to somebody else, that you be there with them with the skill sets to help them maximize the benefit of their experience and hold them together when they're having a tough time. So now, so the psilocybin now has many other uses as well. And that leads into microdosing. So a macrodose is 1% psilocybin, 1 gram of Psilocybin cubensis dried is 10 milligrams, right? So basically 1 gram and higher is a macrodose. Microdoses are 1/10 to 1/20 of that. They're sub-intoxicating or non-perceptual. You cannot feel, you don't feel them sort of in the big way. I feel them in a little way. So it's a little bit on the margin of being perceptual. Color's a little brighter. I'm in a better mood. I'm better with my partner. I'm more congenial. I tend to make bad jokes more often. So it's a mood elevator for me. So is that perceptual? Well, not really in a sense of intoxicating, but it certainly is pleasant and bouldering. So, okay. So we're looking at Psilocybin cubensis mushrooms. And we have 3 categories here: a low dose, a medium dose, and a high dose. So, and you look at the 1/10 to 1/3 of a gram of Psilocybin cubensis, which is 1 to 3 milligrams, about 72 and 16%. So you're looking about 86% of the respondents in this survey were in this microdose range. So we helped design an app for the iPhone and the Droid at Quantified Citizen. It's at microdose.me. I encourage all of you to join in this app. And we wanted to get a very big population of respondents. Again, looking at those meta-surveys, what if we broaden these surveys? We have lots and lots of people self-reporting. Could they report something we would not see in a smaller subset of 10 or 20 people? So we have over 22,000 people now that have signed up for this app and who are self-reporting. And the app is anonymous. It's gone through review of ethics. And then you can type in, what you're microdosing with, what you're adding to the microdose. In this case, it's not only the amount, but also whether you're stacking it with niacin or lion's mane or chocolate or other material. So, and there's challenge tests, and these are all tests that psychiatrists use to measure cognitive function. So these are not just random tests, but these are all based in well-established psychiatric testing models. Well, we went ahead and we published in Nature Scientific Reports 2 papers. And the first paper was kind of a qualifying paper. What's your motivations? What are you doing, et cetera. The second paper is more looking at quote unquote cause and effect, or putatively cause and effect. And so this is where we started to see some really interesting data beyond just motivation. And we found in this report that what the motivation for them is primarily reducing anxiety and depression, increasing performance and cognition, other sorts of metrics like that. Well, we definitely did see an improvement in mood, a reduction of anxiety, a reduction in depression. So this is real data. People are reporting it. Now, when you encounter skeptics who try to dissuade this, and if you're a psychiatrist, isn't your goal to make the patient feel better? So if they have a significant reduction in depression and anxiety, aren't you helping that patient? Sometimes scientists get lost in the weeds. And so, but some of these questions are academically interesting and are valid. So we started looking at something called the stack, and I popularized this. I had a flash of intuition in the around 2015. And I thought, well, if psilocybin is so close to serotonin, it substitutes the serotonin, the receptors, but psilocybin is a vasoconstrictor, niacin is a vasodilator. So I thought with vasodilation, and neuropathies oftentimes present themselves from vasoconstriction and deadening of the fingertips and the toes, that as you can have vasodilation to the endpoints of the peripheral nervous system, you could have more neurogenic benefits. Also, niacin, when you take it, you start itching. It excites your nerve endings, right? It makes you red and itch, and you're super sensitive. So I thought, wow, that's like throughout the entire body. So that's one of the reasons. And then lion's mane mushrooms are really well documented and there's several, I think 4 clinical studies. You can go to mushroomreferences.com. We populate this specifically for researchers and physicians, so you can very quickly get to the medicinal properties of mushrooms. Not branded, just pure science. So some of the studies are presented here with lion's mane mushrooms. It's the mycelium that is by far more potent. It contains these compounds called aronacines that stimulate not only nerve growth factors, but remyelination on the axons of nerves. And then another test, because my discussions with Dr. Pam were saying, yeah, people feel better, they have less anxiety and less depression, but I wanted to know, well, can they perform better? Is there a performance test? And she goes, well, yes, we have a psychomotor test. Physicians often use this. Those physicians here in the audience, you know this well, is how many times you can tap your fingers in 10 seconds. When you're 22, you can tap a lot more when you're 82. But if you have traumatic brain injury, you have interruption of psychomotor skills. When you have dementia, Alzheimer's, or age-related neuropathy, you decline in your tapping frequency. So you can become more, the question is there a coordination benefit? So we went, and this tapping test, which I'm not going to show the whole thing here, but just shows you basically how it activates. And then there's a single tap and there's a double tapping test. Over 100 papers published clinically on the validity of the finger tapping test as an indication of psychomotor benefit. So we got this massive data set, and we have so much data. We have it's in hundreds of millions of data points now from 22,000 people taking these tests and all the different variables that are involved. But something astonishing happened. And the researchers called us up and said, we're not going to give you the data. But we saw something, and we can't believe it. So they attacked the data 3 different ways. And this is what came out that was so surprising with a TAP test. Those people were doing the Stamets stack, a combination of psilocybin mushrooms microdosing, lion's mane, and niacin. In 30 days, over the age of 55, increased their tapping ability from 48 taps to 68 taps in 30 days. There's no other way to explain this, folks. That is a psychomotor coordination benefit. Think of the potential significance of that. So this is not something that people feel, this is how people perform. How many people elderly fall in their kitchens or in the bathroom and break their hips, go to the hospital, get an infection, and die? I mean, if we could reduce just falling, how many guitar players are not able to teach their students when they're in their 70s? and they were maestros when they were in their 50s. Think about the ramifications of being able to improve psychomotor skills in age. So when we saw this data, we tasked our scientists, well, what could possibly explain what's happening here? We narrowed down into MAP kinases. These are proteins that are related to receptors. And if you could, when they stimulate nerve growth factors and BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factors, and when these are stimulated, it increases facilitation of them docking on the outer membranes of cells, actually goes to the nucleus, and then causes the nucleus within the nerves to divide. So these MAP kinases are really well studied. They're called, and the ones we focused on, track A, B, and C. So we sent the individual components of the Stamets stack, and we got some activity with psilocybin and psilocin, the expected cumulative addition, as you see here, red and blue. But when we put them together, we had synergy. In this case, 4x and 6 times more at the microdosing levels, not at macrodosing. So wow, that was interesting. So we started sending in more and more and more samples. Over 1,000 samples that we have sent in. This cost an enormous amount of money to do these tests. And these tests are for preclinical drug discovery. So then we did try to, again, then with track A, all 3 of them, lion's mane, contain aronacines, psilocin, and niacin. And we have something really interesting here. Where at this dosage range, there was no activity of the individual components, but when they were put together, they had synergy. This is related to what's called the gunpowder analogy, where you have 3 components, charcoal, sulfur, potassium nitrate. That's actually a gating 1A exit on the patent office for natural products. If you can have 3 components that do not have activity when combined or explosive, like in gunpowder, if someone invented gunpowder today and we didn't have it before, that would be a patentable natural product combination because they do not co-occur in nature, and the human hand of intervention puts them together with something that was unprecedented. So this is called maximum calculable value, when each of the components do not have activity but synergistically put together they do. We're most fascinated with track Bs. Now this is an extraordinary article, 28 co-authors published in Cell, identifying that the antidepressive effects of the antidepressive medicines, the minor and major medicines, are related to track Bs. And here we also have synergy, maximum calculable value of the components in the stack, which together causes synergy and neurogenesis, neurogeneration. Now, I have over 100 of these. So it's not a 1-2 event, 1-2-3 event. It's an entourage event. You're taking psilocybin and then the analogs. These are baocystin, norbaocystin, norpsilocin, originasin. These are non-psychedelic tryptamines associated with psilocybin and psilocin production, and they also have this synergistic effect. So across the neurological ecosystem and neuroscape, you're eliciting all these excitements of binding affinities and stimulating nerve growth factors and BDNF. So this entourage effect of these components of the natural product, and this is why I think the natural product is better than the single molecule. And 99% approximately of all the clinical studies, maybe it's 96% now, use psilocybin the molecule. But 99, and I'm not exaggerating, 99.99999% of users in the world are using psilocybin the mushroom. So we need to bridge this divide between scientific clinical studies with using psilocybin versus the natural product. So then we started looking at anti-inflammatory cytokines. And this elicits what's called interleukin-10s. These are anti-inflammatories and anti-neuroinflammatories. Also, they induce endogenous antiviral defenses. So this is really interesting. They have something that stimulates nerve cell regeneration. Oftentimes that's associated with inflammation. For those of you who are not experiencing this, when you have cell division, it's just natural. But they have something that downregulates inflammation but promotes neurogeneration. That is very, very cool. So my bottom line hypothesis is that niacin is a catalyst for psilocybin. If you remember that slide where I showed 120 clinical trials, in the very bottom, it said 11 clinical trials used niacin as an active placebo. The reason being, in 20 minutes with psilocybin, you have liftoff. In 20 minutes with niacin, you start itching. But I've talked to several of the clinicians, and they have to keep their mouth shut. But the patients go, "Oh, I'm really hot and I itch," and they got the, well, obviously they got the niacin, but we're not going to say anything. So, again, experienced psychonauts immediately know that they got the placebo. So because there's 11 clinical studies teaching away from my concept, using niacin opposite psilocybin, I think they missed the mark. I think niacin is a catalyst, and niacin's vasodilation property counteracts psilocybin's vasoconstriction. And then the entourage effect that I just described also has that. So we're looking at what is delivery systems that people commonly use. This is by far the most popular, is making your own chocolates. And you kind of have a chocolate party, Of course, do this only where it's legal. So I want to make sure that I'm compliant here. I'm not advocating anyone break the law. Please follow the law. The question and challenge you have is, do you follow state law or federal law? I'll leave that up to you. I don't have an opinion. I'm just a researcher. But I do know from case reports, quote unquote, that when you make this chocolate, you should be very, very careful. So children don't get into it. Somebody visiting doesn't find it and go, "I'm hungry," and eats 5 of these. And then the person's like going, "Oh, I need some help." So the most clever label I've seen put on these chocolates is laxative. That usually discourages anyone from eating them. And keeping them out of the reach of children, of course, is really, really important. Though that's a little bit controversial. The psilocybin may be a very, very good treatment, hopefully and potentially for autism, et cetera. And that being said, everything that I've said to you today has to be proved clinically. These are hypotheses. We have some really good data. We have supporting data. The TAP test is hard to argue against. Because with a TAP test, think about this. With the hundreds of people involved in the TAP test, they're getting psilocybin from various sources illegally, variability in potency, variability in niacin, variability in lion's mane. And yet the p-value of significance is 0.004. That's 1 chance in 250 that it's just random. So with those confounders, if you had it more confined specifically to doses, logically, you would have a better outcome than having it washed with this variability. So we may be understating the potential here. We don't know until we prove this clinically. This is why we are marching towards clinical trials as soon as we can. We hope to have clinical trials comparing the stack versus psilocybin alone versus I think it should be open label. It shouldn't just be a placebo, right? With microdosing, you can do a placebo. With macrodosing, you can't. So maybe, we have to have some creative thinking, and clinicians far smarter than me are involved in this. So what does this potentially mean? If this proves to be true, and again, I'm emphasizing, we don't know. We have to prove this clinically. But the preclinical evidence and the observational data that we have, the prospective observational data we have, is pretty compelling, pretty exciting. So if so, both the peripheral and central and autonomic nervous system could benefit. This could be potentially a game changer. Think of the body intellect in this room, especially of us elders, who have had encyclopedic knowledge only to lose it due to dementia or Alzheimer's or other diseases. That loss of knowledge, culturally speaking, is economically and culturally devastating. To be able to preserve that knowledge to hand it to the next generation is a sacred, sacred duty and an obligation. So I have a group of great scientists that have been involved in helping me in this research, and here's 11 of them. We've published now 77 articles in peer-reviewed journals, not on psilocybin, of course, just a few on psilocybin. But Albert Einstein, I think, in his wisdom, especially as he got older and began to write more philosophically, said a leap in consciousness does not come from logical linear deduction. It's something that happens spontaneously. It's like synaptogenesis, and you have this eureka moment. And the scientists who connect with their spiritual nature, I am not religious, but I'm spiritual. Who could not be spiritual looking at astronomy, looking in the stars? I had a recent experience, and most of my psilocybin experiences are talking about Paul saved the planet, we're all one together, you know, your ancestors are speaking to you, your descendants are calling back in time, speaking to you. You know, I get those messages, I get those marching orders, I get them every time. One of my other experiences more recently, I came out of the experience with one word. And I told my partner, I got one word. I got this one word of wisdom. And I was so I get chills right now just talking about it because I'm remembering the experience. And she goes, what is it? What is it? And the one word in all big capital letters was existence. We all exist. We have always existed. We will forever exist. My atoms will be separated from my molecules and disambiguate and reform, but our atoms together are flowing throughout the universe, throughout the microverse. So in summary, I believe psilocybin makes nicer people. I believe psilocybin reduces violence. I believe psilocybin can break the shackles of addiction. I believe psilocybin reduces crime. When you meet someone who's been traumatized, it's just not them. It's their partner, their family, their neighbors, their community. People know he's an addict, he went to prison, she went to prison, they were violent, they were disruptors in a negative way. So it emanates out through society. It causes a shared trauma in the community. But psilocybin is different. When you meet somebody who's an addict, somebody who's been violent, in fact, I've just met numerous SEALs, and I'm high respect to these warriors who've suffered incredible experiences, you know, in war. Here in Austin, there's a large group, and the SEALs are flocking to psilocybin. There's over 600, I've been told, in a community, going through churches, so it's legal. Law enforcement officers also being traumatized. They're being involved. A law enforcement officer I met in Vancouver, he said, they're not arresting people with psilocybin. Law enforcement officers know that psilocybin reduces crime. I said, well, and he goes, how? I don't understand. How does that change you? He goes, you know, we used to go up to people we have to arrest really aggressive and mean and, you know, intimidating. And, you know, people are scared, right? And they're frightened, they react. And I go, well, what's changed now? He goes, after psilocybin, we walk up to them with a big smile on our face. I go, how you doing today? And the person's nervous, they're law enforcement. And oh, okay. And he goes, I got good news and I got bad news. What do you want first? And he says, amazing. Everyone wants the good news first, right? So you can finish your cup of coffee. I go, what's the bad news? He goes, I got to arrest you. And he said, it's amazing. They arrest these people, whereas before they're aggressive and adversarial and antagonistic. They're having the greatest conversations in the squad car. They're happy, they're cooperative. They're sharing stories about their children and what they like to do, you know, after work. And he goes, and the law enforcement officers are now no longer traumatized. They're no longer on edge and trigger happy because they feel they're going to be attacked. They're relating to the people as with respect and dignity. This is what psilocybin does. Now, we wax poetic, and I have very high expectations, and of course this needs to be proven clinically. But I believe psilocybin is a game changer. And we're at a critical moment in the evolution of our species to have a paradigm shift in consciousness, that we can bring unanimity of all people around the world. This is the message of psilocybin, is we are all one. We're all one community, not only of people, but of all organisms, not only of organisms, but with all matter in the universe. Psilocybin is a gateway into universal consciousness. I think this is our time. This is our time to lead the charge with great science. We want skeptics. My best supporters have been my skeptics. We want to be able to reach across the political aisle. The veterans and the SEALs are bringing Republicans and Democrats together because they know that psilocybin works. Law enforcement knows that it works. The radical improvement in people who are suffering such negative consequences and re-emanating those. And the advantage of psilocybin, like a pebble going into a pond, emanates in waves, go out of positiveness, healing, kindness, and goodness. And now the person that's been cured or is better, is no longer angry, no longer an addict, they fundamentally changed. It's not only them, it's their partner, it's their family, it's their community, it's their country, it's the world. This is our time. Psilocybin is coming to us literally from the mycelial networks underneath our feet. Nature is calling up to us. It is time for us to take psilocybin and to move it forward through science and the medical community. Move it with good guardrails. But if someone goes astray, reaching out your arm and kindness and bringing them back. Never criticize somebody in public. Constructive advice in private. Always praise them for the best that you see in them. That'll elevate everyone. I believe psilocybin is the molecule that can create the paradigm in consciousness and help save the world. Thank you very much.